Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be here again. I've seen the progress in Scandinavia over the past 10 years in terms of recognizing chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME, and the importance that you're now attending to this very disabling and serious disease that I have spent my career both in basic research and in care of patients. It's only my intent today to present a global perspective and a brief introduction, but I'm very happy to be available to any of you who, politicians or physicians or even patients, with respect to anything that you may question or want more information about. And again, I thank you for this opportunity, and I really am impressed with the importance that's now been shown in this country particularly. So what I represent here is our research and our clinical worldwide expertise in this disorder, and we're looking forward to collaboration here in Sweden with the local clinics as well as the governmentally sponsored agencies that are involved in your socialistic healthcare system. And I understand here that politics are involved, and it's a little different than the United States system where most of our medicine is still privately based. But we do interact with the federal agencies, the Center for Disease Control, the Institute of Medicine, the National Institutes of Health. And it's an interesting coalition between private medicine, private foundations, and the government. Just as a brief introduction, I'll go over this very quickly, and I'm happy to be helpful to people later as necessary. But the federal diagnostic criteria were established 25 years ago, so this is not a new thing to the scene. They've been revised several times, and they continue to be debated, and that's a problem in the field. There really is a need for one set of diagnostic criteria accepted worldwide, and we have proposed that, and I hope that the people in decision-making positions in Sweden decide to join the bandwagon and accept the Canadian consensus criteria as how the disease should be diagnosed. But really, we should forget the nomenclature, and we should get on with diagnosing and treating patients. So the prevalence is a question that always comes up because it's been viewed as an orphan disease around the world. It actually doesn't meet criteria for orphan diseases. The prevalence in the United States, by conservative counting, is 400 patients per 100,000, or over 1 million patients, making it much more common than multiple sclerosis, for example. The prevalence in Sweden has been estimated at 40,000, but that's probably underestimated because many patients go undiagnosed. And the prevalence worldwide is 19 million. And I stress that this disease has been found in every country where it's been looked for. It's costly to treat. And I always like to talk to the politicians about this because the direct costs in medical care in the United States is $9 billion a year. The indirect costs, when you add missed work, disability payments, and things like that, is $51 billion. So it's actually one of the most costly diseases to deal with. And one of the reasons for that is most of the patients are disabled. In contrast to other chronic diseases, HIV, diabetes, etc., which are devastating diseases, but people continue to work. Also, it has quite a young onset, so you're looking at disability for many, many years. So that adds to the cost as well. There's problems with it, though, as we have a problem with the diversity of presentation, the pathogenesis, and clinicians and researchers have really been confounded with this problem over the years. What we know about this, and I think it's important to emphasize, and what we found worldwide, is that the symptoms are the same, the presentation is the same, the physical exam is the same, and the immunological abnormalities are basically the same around the world. There's a high degree of limitation of activity. These patients are very, very disabled, even by U.S. federal government standards. They have difficulties with things like showering, breathing, cooking, getting out of bed. What other disease can you mention where people have trouble getting out of bed? So people don't have personal experience, have trouble grasping that. There's a great socioeconomic impact. Most of the patients are permanently unable to work. The average income in the United States is $15,000, and that's from disability payments. So you can't really survive on that. There's insecurity about food. They have no sense of what community they belong to, and there's difficulty with socialization. So what I always say, it's very common for these patients to end up living in the basement of their parents' home, which is a very sad outcome. There's many unmet medical needs and unmet home care needs in all the systems. The brief history. In the pre-80s, as some of you may know, when the disease was first named by Ramsay in the UK, he termed this term ME. And I will use them simultaneously because about 5 years ago, it was decided that we combined ME with CFS and then ultimately decide on a better name. Well, unfortunately, the ultimately has never arrived. So we're still stuck with these names, but we use them interchangeably. Then in the 1980s and early 90s, the focus was on fatigue, and the definition surrounded fatigue because that was the outstanding symptom. And the Holmes criteria, which was established by the CDC in 1988, was a very restricted diagnosis. It was revised in 1994 and became signs and symptoms malaise, and it was a definition that we still live with for research purposes. So if physicians are publishing papers or something, we use the 1994 Fukuda criteria. In the 90s, the definition broadened because the emphasis became on the neurological complaints, the immunological, the recurrent infections, the endocrine abnormalities, and particularly post-exertional malaise, because it's one of the few diseases that is characterized by fatigue worsening with physical or mental exertion. Many chronic diseases actually improve with physical exertion. There has been a number of behind-the-scenes categorical changes with respect to how the disease is diagnosed and how it's categorized and which coding system you use. And there's a different coding system in Europe than in the United States, which is really of not particular consequence. There was a consensus diagnosis criteria established in 2003 called the Canadian Consensus Criteria, which is what we mostly use. There's been, these criteria have been in place for 25 years. For the physicians in the room, we got to stop arguing about this and move forward. Here's the Canadian Consensus criteria. I won't go over those. Many of you already know those, but this is for your reference. It's the guidelines that we use. This is a recent development in the United States. We have the patients and researchers who are on advocacy groups, and they give their input to the Chronic Fatigue Syndrome Advisory Committee, which directly advises the HHS, which is our central agency that controls health in the United States. They recently gave an independent contract to the Institute of Medicine in order to redefine the disease and to use standards of care, evidence-based medicine, and then they're going to proselytize this to the whole world. This is their ambitious plan that over the next 18 months, this diagnosis will be made, this change will be made based on evidence-based medicine, and there will be new recommendations. We'll have to wait and see if that takes place. So the model of ME/CFS now is that patients have a genetic predisposition that's been demonstrated many, many times, that an infection, trauma, stress, or toxins can then set off the chain of reactions that's mediated by changes in the endocrine system and in the immunological system that results in the symptoms that we call ME/CFS. So in medicine, we try to make the most accurate diagnosis. We determine how severe it is, and we try to do therapeutic interventions. There's challenges to this in chronic fatigue, though, in that the population is very heterogeneous. There's not a good biomarker. That means there's not a simple test for this where you can order one test and make the diagnosis. There's different clinical definitions. There's different viewpoints, whether you're practicing in the UK or the United States or Japan. There's no licensed drug, and if you think about it, a lot of diseases are kind of defined by the therapy for the disease, and there's no really good surrogate markers. However, what we've realized over years and years of research is that we really need to concentrate on subsets of patients that match each other, that are homogeneous, and we can establish an etiology and a treatment. And that's pretty much accepted. The FDA, is our agency that approves drugs, and drug development takes 8 to 15 years and $100 million. So there is no licensed drug for chronic fatigue ME right now. So this is going to be a long process, unfortunately. They require well-documented and validated endpoints, and we don't have very good endpoints at this point in time. So how do we approach these challenges? Well, one of the ways we're looking to do this is through computational analysis and bioinformatics. What that basically means is you take a whole bunch of information from thousands and thousands of patients, and then you look for it statistically for correlations and potential interventions. And that's being done. We have now a worldwide database. It started in the United States, and it's now spread to most countries, and I'm trying to encourage the Swedish doctors and institutions to join so that you can participate in this. We're looking for novel pathogen discovery, for new agents. We're looking for immunological biomarkers, endpoint evaluation so that drugs can be improved. And in spite of this slow progress, drug development and clinical trials are going on. So there are biological markers that most physicians in the world agree with. Chronic fatigue ME is called low natural killer cell disease in Japan. And the most common abnormality worldwide is impairment of NK cell function. And interestingly, natural killer cells were actually first described here in Sweden many years ago. So you have the scientific expertise here to drive this research forward. We're associated with Griffith University, Sonia Marshall in Australia, who's doing some really innovative work in terms of biomarkers and microRNAs. Physicians in the room know that that's a real hot field right now, and its utility remains to be determined. Right here, Dr. Jan Bryson is focusing his research on NK cell function. There's many other people in your local community here. I'm impressed, the virologists and the chemists and proteomics, and there's a lot of the basic science here that could contribute to the research worldwide. And we're looking for global collaboration, as I mentioned. There's more than 5,000 peer-reviewed articles. So this is not a new field. This is not speculative. And I just listed a lot of the, some of the recent publications with respect to NK cell function and dysfunction. Well, the FDA in January declined the provisional approval of Ampligen. That's a drug that's been used in chronic fatigue since 1988. And the reason they did that is they said it was a safe drug, but there weren't objective endpoints. So we physicians really have to work hard on designing better clinical trials, multi-centered, meaning international, meaning this can't be some little study that was done in the United States and then expect the rest of the world to accept that. And we're working on some endpoint markers for that, so that in the future. Now, you've all probably heard about the Norwegian Research Council that has allowed a phase 3 trial of rituximab just across the border here. And the initial results are kind of positive. We're looking for more studies. Some have been proposed, one in California at the Open Medicine Institute, and the Invest in ME charity in London, UK is trying to support a study with that particular drug. The Open Medicine Institute in Mountain View, California, there's a representative of that organization here today, has a very ambitious research and treatment plan for the future with some grants and outside funding and a mix of governmental funding to achieve some of these goals that I mentioned. So the Center for Disease Control set up a study to see how physicians define the disease and to see if we can find a better phenotype or a better way of describing patients. They proposed a 5-year study. We're now in year 2 of that study. Here's the participating clinics, and what they did is they took the physicians who see a lot of patients, and we were consulted with respect to entrance into this. And their conclusions is that there's a great deal of difference between sites and that a clinical definition is probably not going to be sufficient to diagnose and treat these patients. But they are developing instruments that will be helpful for all of us to measure various things about these patients. And I would encourage all the Swedish patients and physicians to join in this network rather than try to reinvent the wheel and do things that have cost millions and millions of dollars to set up, when now simply with the internet you can just join with the databases that are there. So year 2, there's doing follow-up, there's projects projected. Our government is now shut down, so these projects have all been put on hold, but presumably when that's resolved, we'll be back on track. So the novel pathogen study, many of the patients are aware of this. Dr. Ian Lipkin in Colombia, who is called the virus hunter, and he's discovered over 500 new viruses, is looking in depth at these patients, both their blood, their saliva, their urine, tears, to see if there's any novel pathogens. He has some preliminary results that were very exciting to people, and he's completing those studies. He's doing high throughput sequencing, and that's an exciting project. He looks at the communication system, how your immune system communicates with your brain and the rest of your body, and he has found some very interesting abnormalities there. We began a new study of the cerebral spinal fluid. Many of these patients have what they call brain fog, and they have difficulty concentrating and difficulty performing tasks. And the theory is that they have a problem probably with cytokines or other inflammatory markers within their brain. So we went to the source and are looking at the spinal fluid. That's been done in other places in the world as well. And he's found some interesting markers, indeed suggesting that there's inflammation in the brain of these patients. There's a lot of work to be done. This is underfunded as well. Dr. Lipkin made an appeal for increased funding. We'll see if that happens so we can complete that study. So in summary, very briefly, worldwide collaboration is really necessary. We need to define the patients better. It needs to be universal. Everybody needs to define this the same way. We need to determine a specific diagnosis. The prognosis, we know, untreated, the prognosis is bad. People do not recover. They can be treated and they can have an improved quality of life, particularly if they have experts. And I would encourage the healthcare system here to consider centers of excellence where the patients could be treated by experts, then return to their primary care physicians for ongoing care. We need to find the pathogenesis and the mechanism of disease. I showed you the research that's going on with that. The research is ahead of the clinical care in the United States. We're actually doing more research than we are taking care of patients. We need to design appropriate interventional studies that meet regulatory agencies' requirements, because even if there was a successful drug right now, it probably wouldn't be licensed. We need to create centers of excellence. This is going on in the United States. And we have an open invitation to collaborate with the clinics here that are in existence in Sweden. And if there's proposals for new ones, we're happy and open for collaboration. So with that, I stay on time, and I thank you. And there's a view of Lake Tahoe for you all.
Thank you, Daniel, for coming to Sweden and give us this excellent presentation of the disease and the problems with this very complex disease. We have 5 minutes for questions, so please take your chance and ask one of the world's most famous experts in this field. Okay. Professor Gottfries was the first one.
While you are here, I would indeed like to ask you about something. In Sweden, we have a severe discussion among colleagues whether this really is a disease. There are some who say it's not. There are some who say it is due to psychosomatic disorders. I know, you know that we think it is a more somatic disease. Do you have that discussion in the US?
I can happily say we used to have that. We no longer have that discussion. So
Wonderful.
That's progress that's been made.
More questions? There were at least 2 hands up more. Professor Sven Britton, I think.
Yes. Thank you very much. May I remind you that psychosomatic disease is also a disease, so you can't neglect those. But I wonder, you said that there was a requirement for a biomarker to generate a drug against this, but for psychiatric diseases there are no biomarkers, and yet pharmacological treatment is rampant, isn't it? Too rampant, even.
We have made that point to the FDA on numerous occasions. And under some circumstances, you can get a drug licensed by demonstrating improved quality of life, which is how, for example, the antidepressants are licensed. We tried that. They didn't accept it in the case of this drug.
And Professor Bengtsson, Parliament member also.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for your eloquent speak on this complex problem. I have one question, given the fact that you have overcome the obstacle in the United States by having respect for this disorder as being a disease. What would you say is the main bottleneck in the progress forward? Is it information to the public, to physicians? Is it the research, the clinical trials on pharmaceuticals?
I think that's a wonderful question, because most of the medical research in the United States now is funded by pharmacy. It's not the government. And so without a good biomarker and without the clear-cut pathogenesis, the drug companies aren't very interested. So that's been a huge problem in terms of our traditional funding schedule. The research is actually going very well, which is also largely privately funded. CFS ME gets very, very little federal funding. In fact, I'm embarrassed to say it's $9 million a year. So it's virtually nothing compared to many other diseases. However, the research is going along well. It's the, I think, lack of clear-cut understanding and a lack of how it should be approached. And most diseases in the United States are handled by primary care physicians, and this is a very difficult disease for primary care physicians to handle. So it becomes an outlier. It becomes one that is amenable to approach such as a Center for Excellence. It just hasn't happened. And the part of that is that there's been such a dramatic diminution in funding for public health.
Yes, we have one more question, and then we have to go
My
on.
name is Malin Arnhem from the Socialstyrelsen, National Board of Health. I just have a question on what's your opinion? Is this increasing, this problem, or is it just that patients have not been diagnosed before, or is it the prevalence growing? And also on prevention, is there any research on prevention?
Those are absolutely wonderful questions. Certainly, the prevalence figures have been stable for quite a few years now in the United States. So I'm not sure there's an increased incidence, but there's certainly increased recognition. And one of the questions is always that why is this not seen in minorities and in socioeconomically depressed patient populations? And the answer in the United States is that it is, but they don't have access to health care. So they go undiagnosed. But the studies who have gone into the inner cities and looked at American Indians and looked at Hispanic populations, et cetera, find almost the same incidence of disease.